Welcome to our channel. If you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our spooky stories. I have always been skeptical about the paranormal. I grew up hearing ghost stories but never paid much attention to them. However, my curiosity was piqued by a specific place that repeatedly appeared in the urban legends of my city, Riverview Asylum. Riverview is located on the outskirts of town, isolated and forgotten by time. The building, imposing and decayed, is surrounded by a dense forest that seems to envelop the place in a dark embrace. The locals avoid the area and whisper terrible stories about the horrors that occurred inside. They say that the screams of the patients can still be heard on the quietest nights. I decided I needed to see for myself. Armed with a camera and an audio recorder, I planned my visit to the asylum. As soon as I stepped onto the property, I felt a change in the air, a heavy weight that seemed to smother any hope or joy. The windows were broken, and the overgrown vegetation invaded the dark hallways. I entered through the front door, which creaked as if complaining about my presence. The silence was absolute, interrupted only by the sound of my footsteps echoing through the empty corridors. The darkness was almost complete, except for the weak light coming through the dirty, broken windows. Walking through the hallways, I felt an unsettling sensation of being watched. I looked around but saw nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. The walls were covered with graffiti and strange symbols, as if previous visitors had tried to leave a mark or a warning. I knew the asylum had a dark history. Built in the early 20th century, Riverview was intended to care for the mentally ill but soon gained a reputation for its inhumane practices. Patients were subjected to brutal treatments, and many died under horrific conditions. Over time, rumors of paranormal activities began to circulate, and the place was abandoned. I ventured deeper into the building, and the signs of decay became more evident. Peeling walls, broken furniture, and documents scattered on the floor. I found what seemed to be a records room and began flipping through old files. The reports detailed cruel treatments and inhumane experiments conducted on the patients. As I read, I felt a chill run down my spine. It was clear that something terrible had happened here, something that had left a deep and disturbing mark on the place. I closed the file, determined to continue my investigation and uncover the truth about Riverview Asylum. But as I moved through the building, I couldn't imagine the horrors that were about to be revealed. What seemed like a simple exploration would soon turn into an unimaginable nightmare, where the secrets of the dead would come to light and the line between reality and the supernatural would begin to blur. The first night at Riverview Asylum was unforgettable. I prepared my equipment, camera, audio recorder, and a powerful flashlight. I wanted to capture any signs of paranormal activity. Twilight fell over the building, and the shadows seemed to grow, dancing on the crumbling walls. I entered again through the main door, which groaned in protest, and was immediately enveloped by the cold of the place. The main corridor was long and narrow, with doors on either side. Some were ajar, revealing empty rooms with rusty beds and torn mattresses. I walked slowly, each step echoing through the building. Suddenly, a noise. A faint creak, as if a door was moving on its own. I stopped, holding my breath, and listened carefully.
Silence.
I continued exploring, my heart racing. I reached a larger room, which seemed to have been some sort of dining hall. Tables and chairs were scattered, some turned on their side. In the corner of the room was an old wheelchair. I approached it and observed it for a moment. That's when I felt a shiver on the back of my neck. I quickly turned around but saw nothing. The feeling of being watched was unmistakable. I grabbed the audio recorder and began asking questions aloud, hoping to capture some EVP. Is anyone here with me? If you can hear me, please give me a sign. I waited. Absolute silence. I repeated the question, but again, nothing but silence. I continued my journey through the hallways, entering various rooms. Each seemed to carry a heavy emotional load. In one of the rooms, I found an old notebook. The pages were yellowed with age but still legible. The writings were from a patient describing his daily torment, the electroshock sessions, and the screams echoing through the hallways at night. As I read, I heard a distinct sound of footsteps behind me. I turned quickly, but again, nothing. The flashlight wavered in my hand. I decided it was time to explore the upper floors. I climbed the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. When I reached the second floor, I noticed that the atmosphere seemed even heavier. It was then that the temperature dropped drastically. The air turned icy, and my breath turned into vapor. The flashlight began to flicker and soon went out. I was left in the dark trying to turn the flashlight back on when I heard a whisper very close to my ear, "Leave." Fear overtook me. I managed to turn on the flashlight and illuminated the corridor. Nothing. But the sense of imminent danger was palpable. I decided it was time to leave. I rushed down the stairs, feeling a presence following me closely. I reached the front door and, looking back, saw a shadow moving swiftly down the hallway. I ran out of the building, my heart racing. Outside, the sense of relief was immediate, but the question remained: what really happened during that first visit? The warning signs were clear, but my curiosity was still unsatisfied. I knew I needed to return and uncover the hidden truth in the shadows of Riverview Asylum. The second visit to Riverview Asylum was decided with a mix of fear and determination. The memories of the first night were still fresh, but curiosity drove me to discover what really lurked in that place. This time, I was better prepared, with an extra flashlight and better recording equipment. I arrived early before sunset to take advantage of the natural light while it was still possible. I entered again through the main corridor, which seemed even more oppressive. The darkness seemed to swallow the flashlight's light, and a biting cold filled the air. I decided to explore the more remote wings, those that had been left behind and where the victims' screams had been the loudest. I passed through a series of rusted doors and narrow corridors until I reached a room that seemed to have been an office. Documents were scattered across the floor, and a musty smell filled the air. Among the papers, I found a file with a yellowed and worn label, "A Treatment Records Patients." I opened the file with trembling hands and began to read. The content was disturbing. The notes described cruel treatment methods, high-voltage electroshocks, extreme isolation, and even invasive experiments conducted without anesthesia. Reading about the abuse and torture cases left me with a lump in my throat. Each word seemed to echo the suffering of the patients. As I flipped through the records, I started to hear a subtle sound, as if something was moving nearby. I looked up, but the room was empty. I continued exploring and found a small room next to the office. The door was ajar, and a strong metallic smell emanated from inside. I pushed the door open and entered, finding an even more shocking scene: a torture chamber, equipped with old and bloody instruments. The screams of the victims still seemed to resonate in the walls. In one corner, a restraint chair was stained with what appeared to be dried blood. The cold in the room was intense, and I felt a crushing weight on my chest. The atmosphere was so laden with suffering that I felt physically ill. I decided to go upstairs, where rumors suggested extreme isolation had been practiced. I climbed the stairs, the sound of my footsteps echoing, until I found a series of small, dark cells. The doors were locked, but some were open, revealing empty, filthy rooms. In one of the open cells, I found a worn-out diary. The pages were covered with hasty and disordered writings. I read the diary with growing discomfort as the description of the horrors the patients were subjected to unfolded before me. The account spoke of muffled screams, terror, and a sense of absolute despair. At the end of the diary, the writing became increasingly incoherent and terrified. With the diary in hand, I decided to take a break to review the material. Sitting in a corner, I began to hear indistinct murmurs, as if several voices were talking at once. I looked around but saw no one. The voices intensified, turning into sharp, desperate screams. That's when the flashlight started to flicker again, and a piercing cold enveloped the room. I knew something was deeply wrong. The evidence was clear and horrifying. What I was witnessing were not just stories or urban legends. They were the cries of tormented souls, seeking justice and recognition. The tortures that had occurred here had left an indelible mark, not only on the walls but on the very souls of the patients who had suffered. My head was spinning with the discoveries. I needed to leave the place to process what I had found, but at the same time, I knew there was much more to be revealed. Riverview Asylum was only showing me the surface of its horrible secrets. On my third visit to Riverview Asylum, I was determined to capture any clear evidence of paranormal activity. What I did not expect was for the experience to become so terrifying. I decided to stay overnight, armed with all available technology to record inexplicable phenomena. Darkness fell quickly, and the place turned into a maze of shadows and disturbing silences. I began the exploration around midnight when the silence seemed thicker and the shadows moved in a sinister manner. With each step, the air grew colder, and an increasing sense of discomfort accompanied me. My flashlight briefly illuminated the corridors, revealing cryptic messages on the walls and objects scattered on the floor. It was then that the events started to intensify. I entered a room that seemed to be an old dormitory. As I set up the camera, I heard a low and constant sound, as if someone was crying. The noise was agonizing and seemed to come from one of the rooms. I decided to investigate. I followed the sound to a room at the back. The door was ajar, and as I pushed it open, what I saw was heart-wrenching. A torn mattress and an overturned chair, as if someone had tried to escape in panic. The crying continued, and I realized it was coming from a point near the window. I approached, and when I looked outside, something made me stop immediately. In the dark, shadows moved erratically, and the trees swayed violently despite the lack of wind. I felt a cold presence beside me and turned to find a spectral figure. It was a pale, ethereal silhouette with an expression of deep despair. The figure seemed to be pleading for help, but vanished before I could react. Shaking with fear, I tried to capture the phenomenon with the camera, but the image was blurred and indistinct. I decided it was time for a direct confrontation. I went back to the corridor and, using an EVP recorder, began to ask questions. Why are you here? What happened to you? The responses started coming, not in words, but in muffled whispers and distant screams. In a moment of desperation, a door slammed shut with such force that it nearly made me fall. I ran to it and pushed, but it was locked. The sense of panic increased, and I knew I needed to find an exit before it was too late. I quickly walked through the corridors, feeling the air becoming denser and more oppressive. The noise of voices grew louder, and the whispers turned into deafening screams. The walls seemed to close in around me, and the sounds of fast, erratic footsteps echoed behind me. I felt a cold, invisible hand touch my shoulder, and a jolt of terror ran through my body. I looked back and saw a shadow moving rapidly through the corridors, accompanied by a threatening presence. In a desperate attempt to escape, I reached the dining hall. The place was in complete chaos, with chairs and tables scattered as if someone had made a desperate attempt to flee. My flashlight flickered wildly and went out, plunging me into total darkness. The screams and whispers became an unceasing clamor, and the sense of imminent danger was overwhelming. Finally, the main door was in sight. I ran towards it, feeling the dark presence closing in, almost as if it were trying to prevent my escape. When I finally stepped outside, the cold night air greeted me, but the feeling of relief was mixed with profound terror. The experiences I had that night proved that Riverview Asylum was not just a place with a horrible past. It was a place where tormented souls still roamed, feeding a force of vengeance and agony that seemed never to fade. I knew I was in danger, but my mind was still trying to process the intensity of the previous events. I decided I needed to leave Riverview Asylum as quickly as possible. Every hallway I traversed seemed to transform into a maze of panic. The environment was now saturated with a sense of foreboding and an almost palpable presence of hostility. I hurried down the stairs, the sound of my footsteps echoing with a sinister resonance. The cold in the air seemed to have intensified, and the atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive. The voices and screams I had heard before began to become clearer, as if they were becoming more audible, more desperate. When I reached the ground floor, I realized that something was terribly wrong. The main door, which had been my only escape route, was locked with a heavy padlock. The feeling of panic turned into despair. The padlock was tightly secured, and despite my attempts, I couldn't move it. As I struggled with the padlock, I heard a noise coming from the hallway, a series of rapid, heavy footsteps. The sound was getting closer, and as I looked down the corridor, I saw a dark figure emerge from the darkness. It was one of the most aggressive spirits I had encountered, an entity that seemed filled with intense, uncontrolled rage. Its face was a mask of suffering and fury. My attempt to negotiate or appeal to its humanity was in vain. The entity seemed to not recognize my presence, only moving with a frightening determination toward me. I knew I had little time before it reached me. In one last attempt to escape, I hurled the camera and recorder against the door, hoping to find a way to force the exit. The noise of cracking and the sound of heavy breathing was deafening. Amidst the chaos, I heard a piercing scream coming from the end of the corridor. It was a scream that seemed to come from a deep abyss, full of pain and agony. The walls seemed to vibrate with the intensity of the scream, and the energy in the air was charged with an almost electric force. As I tried to force the door open, the entity was only a few meters away from me. I felt a cold, invisible hand tightening around my chest, and the sensation of an oppressive force pressing me down. My thoughts were muddled, and I struggled to stay calm. In a final desperate attempt, I turned to face the entity and tried to speak to it, my voice trembling, Please let me go. I can't stay here any longer." The spirit seemed to hesitate for a moment, a shadow of doubt passing across its distorted visage. Then, in an instant, the force around me seemed to dissipate. With one final effort, I managed to break the padlock and the door opened with a bang. I ran out of the asylum, not looking back. The fresh night air was a relief, but the terror of the experience still haunted me. I knew the battle wasn't over, that the tormented souls were still inside, waiting for some kind of justice that would never come. As I looked at the building one last time, I saw a dark figure in the window, watching me. A sense of sadness and despair hung in the air. I knew I could never forget what I had experienced in that place. Riverview Asylum was not just an abandoned building, it was a monument to suffering and vengeance, a place where the past and present met in a terrifying fusion of pain and despair. Back in the safety of my car, the memories of the night at Riverview Asylum still echoed in my mind like a vivid nightmare. The sense of relief at leaving that place was palpable, but it soon gave way to a deep introspection about what I had lived through. The night was marked by a series of terrifying encounters that defied logic. The asylum, with its stained walls and dark hallways, seemed alive with a disturbing energy, a presence that was not merely a remnant of past horrors but an active force still tormenting the present. The screams and whispers, the eyes peering from the shadows, and the constant sense of an oppressive presence were more than mere illusions. They were silent witnesses to the suffering of hundreds of souls, trapped in an endless cycle of pain and revenge. The experience was a brutal reminder of how the echoes of the past can resonate in ways that surpass human understanding. I arrived home and reviewed the recordings and documents I had collected. The evidence was undeniable: captured voices, distorted images, and records confirming the stories of torture and suffering. However, the most disturbing thing was the feeling that something had changed within me. The fear and anguish I felt in the asylum had transformed into a psychological weight I couldn't shake. I tried to find some comfort in my own safety, but the images of those desperate souls continued to haunt my thoughts. They were not just stories or legends. They were the brutal reality of lives destroyed by an unrelenting and cruel system. What I experienced at Riverview Asylum was more than a mere encounter with the supernatural. It was a confrontation with absolute evil and a lesson on the lasting impact of injustices and cruelties that occur when society's eyes turn away. The pain of the patients did not disappear with their deaths. It manifested as a form of vengeance that continued to haunt the place where they suffered. My experience made it clear that some places carry an emotional and spiritual weight so intense that it defies any rational explanation. Riverview Asylum was a monument to human suffering, and the souls that had passed through it were not ready to rest. They remained active, awaiting recognition and a reckoning that seemed increasingly elusive. Back to my daily routine, I feel a constant unease. The feeling of being watched never completely disappeared. What happened that night was a stark reminder that some secrets are more than just stories. They are the visceral representation of human horror and agony. And even outside that place, the mark left by Riverview Asylum continues to be felt, like a perennial shadow on my mind and soul.